Well, now, storytelling for me goes way, way back, all the way to my childhood. I love to crawl in bed with my mama and listen to her Brer Rabbit stories and her Bible stories. I love to climb up on the barber chair in my granddaddy's barber shop and listen to my granddaddy and the men in the barber shop tell stories. and my sisters and I, we love to talk my daddy into telling stories. My daddy was a Methodist preacher, and out in our backyard in Griffin, Georgia, where we lived at the time, there was a little bitty chicken coop type building that my daddy made into his office. He stripped everything out of that building, built some bookcases, and put a door, built a door up on one side of it that could be a desktop, put in some filing cabinets and all those bookcases, like I said, and a big old wooden swivel office chair in there, and a little rug down. And that was his office. That's where he'd work on his sermons and stuff. But my sisters and I, we'd be playing out in the yard, and we'd say, "Oh, I wish Daddy would tell us a story." And my daddy would be inside working on a sermon or stuff, but we knew that we could get him to tell us a story. So we'd go to the door, knock on the door, and say, "Daddy, will you tell us about skinny dipping in the Yellow River?" My daddy couldn't resist it. He'd tell us about it. 9 times out of 10, he'd let us come in. My sisters and I'd sit on the floor of that little office. My daddy would swivel that chair around and face us and sit there and tell us. He'd say, "Oh, it was hot. It was hot that summer." And Jim and I, you see, back then he called his brother James Jim, and most of his brothers called him Bud. But when he and Jim were just little bitty, they lived in Milstead, Georgia, a little mill town down in central Georgia. And my daddy said, "Oh, it was so hot. Jim and I were playing out in the little alley behind the house there. It was so dusty and hot, and we were thirsty and uncomfortable. And we could hear something way off in the distance. We could hear the sounds of kids playing in the river. You see, the Yellow River flows right through Milstead, right by the old mill there, around a big old curve there, and into the swimming hole. But my granddaddy, Grady Shaw, he had told those boys time and time and time again, "Boys, don't you ever go down to that swimming hole without me." They knew he was serious about it too. He said, "I'll wear you out if you ever go down to that swimming hole without me." They had been down there with their daddy, and they had played in the river a little bit there with their daddy. But they could hear those boys down there swimming and splashing and having a great old time. And they knew their daddy would be down at the barber shop for several more hours. And Jim said, "Bud, I sure would like to go swimming." Bud said, "Well, I would too, but you know what Daddy said, we'd get in big trouble if we go down there." Jim said, "Well, now, we wouldn't have to go swimming. We could just go down there and see what's going on." And Charles said, well, actually, they called him Bud. Bud said, "Oh, James, you know we'll get in big trouble. Couldn't we just go look? Daddy wouldn't have to know about it." Well, the temptation was just too great. And Charles finally said, "All right, Jim, maybe we can just go down there and see what's going on, maybe put our feet in the water a little bit." And so they walked on down that little dusty alleyway until it got to the Dinky tracks. Now you need to know about the Dinky. The Dinky was a little narrow gauge railroad. It only went 3 miles from Conyers to Little Milstead where the mill was. It was narrow gauge. That means the tracks were closer together than regular railroad trains. And that little train just went back and forth that 3 miles all the time, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth every day. It would pick up cotton off the big trains in Conyers and bring that cotton, those big old cotton bales, out to the mill. And at the mill, they'd unload it, and that cotton would get carded and get spun and get woven into denim. Just like your jeans, right? Your jeans are made out of denim, into denim. And those great big old rolls of denim cloth would be taken back to the empty Dinky and put on board that boxcar. And then the Dinky would go back to Conyers with a load of denim to go on the trains and be taken all over the world to be made into blue jeans. That's what that dinky did every day. Hub Doyle was the engineer. Everybody in town knew him. And everybody in town knew their daddy, the barber, of course, because they all loved to go to the barber shop, get their hair cut, and the men sit around and tell stories. So, and Hub Doyle was one of the big talkers in town. At any rate, as they got to the dinky tracks, they decided to walk on down to the to the trestle that went over the river, because there was a path down next to the trestle, a red clay path down to the trestle, from the trestle to the river, and they could walk along that path to get to the swimming hole. So they started walking down the track. Now, of course, they'd each trying to balance on a different one of the of the tracks as they walked along the rails, and as they were walking along, just talking and not paying much attention, all of a sudden Jim said, "Bud, do you hear something?" "I don't think so." "Well, I feel a vibration, I think." Well, they both jumped down, put their heads down with their ears against the rails, and as soon as they did, they knew the dinky was on his way. They jumped up, and just as they jumped up, they saw the dinky coming around a curve in the tracks right toward them. And there was Hub Doyle leaning out the window, of the side window of that train, of the dinky engine, saying, "I see you, Shaw boys. I know what you're up to. You're on your way down to the river. I'm going to tell Mr. Grady at the barber shop as soon as I get there that you boys are headed down to the river." You see, back in those days, in Millstead anyway, you couldn't get away with anything, because all the grown-ups were talking to each other all the time, and they'd tell on you. Charles and Jim just looked at each other. Oh, Charles said, "We in trouble now. We better hurry up and get back to the house." Jim said, "Now, wait a minute, Bud. Think about this thing for a minute. What's going to happen when we get back to the house?" "Oh," Charles said, "oh, Daddy's going to whoop us for sure. We're going to get a spanking. I know we're going to get a spanking, because Bub Doyle's going to tell him that we were headed down the swimming hole." Jim said, "Yeah, that's what's going to happen, all right. We're going to get a spanking, aren't we?" "We sure are. We're going to get a spanking. We better hurry back to the house." "Why hurry back to the house?" "Well, because..." "What do you mean?" "Well, we're going to get a spanking. We might as well swim a little while before we get our spanking." Now, Charles hadn't thought about that. And he couldn't argue with the logic. It made perfect sense. So the boys decided they'd just go on down there. So they did that. They slippity-slide down that little path from the trestle all the way to the river, walked along the river, came around the curve, and they could see them. There must have been 25 or 30 boys in that swimming hole. And there was a great big old tulip poplar tree stood up beside the river there, and somebody had shinnied up that thing and tied a great big old rope on a limb. And the boys were taking turns. They tied a stick into the bottom of that rope, and they took turns climbing up that bank next to the river. And then they'd get a running start and run down that bank and fling themselves off the side of the bank, swinging way out of the river. And when they got to the highest point, they'd let go and sploosh into that water. They were having a ball, and Charles and James couldn't wait. So I kind of like this part. One of them ran to one tree and he stripped off all his clothes. Charles ran to another tree, he stripped off his clothes, and they both ran together. And they took turns swinging. Oh, those boys had a good time. It was a blue sky day, white clouds in the sky, beautiful day for a swim. All of those boys in town were just swimming around, having a great time all afternoon, forgetting all their troubles. Well, now, you kids that are listening to me, if you're in 4th grade, you've probably studied about weather. And you know about weather fronts. You know how sometimes a warm weather front full of moisture comes up off the Gulf of Mexico and rolls up across Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia toward our way, right? And sometimes that's at the same time that a cold front rolls down from the north. Maybe it's when the jet stream, is bending down there. And as those two fronts meet, the warm front goes up over that cold front. And where they meet, it cools off and starts dropping its moisture. And there's rain in there. And if those fronts are big and moving fast, you know what can happen then? You can have a real storm. That's when big thunderheads build up, and there's lightning and thunder and torrential rain. And that's what was happening right then, even though those boys didn't know it. You know where it was happening? It was happening upstream, up around Snellville, up in Gwinnett County. It was raining cats and dogs up there, and water was filling up all those little streams and rivers, and all headed on its way to the Yellow River. The boys didn't know that. They were swimming around having a good time. They didn't even notice as the sky began to cloud up. And Charles and James didn't even notice as the pool got a little less crowded. They were swimming around having a good time. But the river was getting deeper. And the river was getting faster. And they were swimming around, and James said, Charles, whew, this water's getting kind of swift. Charles said, sure is. Maybe we better, well, where is everybody? And they looked around. They were the only ones left in the river. Everybody else had sense enough to get out and head toward home. Charles said, we better get out of here. About that time, there was a real loud lightning. Rain started pouring down on them, and Charles and James started swimming for the shore. Charles got to the shore right underneath that big old tree. There were some roots and all hanging out of that red clay bank. He slipped and slid as he managed to climb himself up, and he turned around and looked at him. Can I help you, James? 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 And he looked out in the river, and there James' head popped up out of the water. James was saying, Charles, Charles! Down he went again. James was going up and down. Charles didn't have any choice. He had to jump back in that river. He swam across against that current till he got to James, and James was fighting him so hard he nearly drowned both of them. But Charles managed to get his arm around James's neck and start dog paddling backwards with one arm, trying to get to that shore. When he finally made it to shore, the two boys finally were able to slither up that bank, slipping and sliding until they got to the top. And just as they got to the top, the brightest lightning either of them had ever seen, the loudest immediate boom either one of them had ever seen, split that tulip poplar tree right in the middle, and the tree fell between those two boys. Charles! They were screaming and yelling. Charles said, get your things and let's go. Charles grabbed his clothes, went through the brush trying to get to his brother, grabbed his brother's hand, and the two of them started heading for home. When they got to Main Street, their water was pouring down them. Every single stitch on their body was wet as they walked down that street toward their house. And as soon as they saw 312 down there, they could tell there was their daddy. My daddy Shaw, my granddaddy, their daddy, arms crossed, standing on the porch of that house, watching them come. And when they climbed to the top of the stairs and looked at their daddy's face, he looked at them very solemnly, and he said, boys, did you go swimming in that river? Yes, sir, Daddy. Haven't I told you not to go swimming in that river? Yes, sir, Daddy. Are you ever going to go swimming in that river without me again? No, Daddy. You know, my daddy and his brother James both got a few paddlings over the years, but that day, Grady Shaw, my granddaddy, could look in the eyes of Bud and Jim and tell that they had had a baptism by water and fire that would put them in good stead for the future. He didn't think he had to worry about them going swimming without him again, and they didn't. And that's the story about skinny dipping in the Yellow River that comes from my very own family. My daddy told me that lots of times, and I'm telling it to you. You know what? You have stories in your family. Your mama, your daddy, your Uncle Henry and Aunt Sally, your granny and your granddaddy. Any of the grown-ups in your family, they have stories. Things happen to them when they were kids that are funny or scary. Yeah, things happen that are interesting. You need to find out about them. You might ask them things like, have you ever broken a bone? Tell me about it. Or, did you ever cut somebody's hair when you weren't supposed to cut their hair? Or the dog's hair, or the cat's hair? Did somebody cut your hair? Have there ever been any hair cutting incidents in your family? I'll bet you there's somebody in your family that said, oh, I remember the time. Ask them, did you ever get lost from your family? Or did somebody in your family get lost, maybe in a store or on a trip? I'll bet somebody will have a story about that. You see, there's stories in all of our families. And now while we're stuck at home for a while, a wonderful, fun way of spending an afternoon or an evening is sharing those stories of the things that happen to us. And we sometimes learn something from those stories. But whether we learn anything or not, they're kind of fun to tell. So ask some of those questions of the grown-ups in your family. And then you can kind of ask some of those questions for yourself. And when we get back to school and your teacher wants you to write a story, think of one of those things and you can write a little bit about that. It won't be hard at all because it'll be a story that you have in your own head already that you can tell about. I hope you've enjoyed the silly story from my daddy way back about must have been 1928 or 29 in Milstead, Georgia. And I'm still telling that story today, even though my daddy's been gone for 30 years. I'll bet you have some stories in your family to tell too. Thank you. I hope you've had a good time with this. I've sure had a good time telling it. Bye-bye.